Hello, my talk is called Virginia Woolf, Eccentricity and Essay Writing. Virginia Woolf wrote an essay in 1919 called The Eccentrics. You might not want to have your whole life summed up by that word, she says, but suggests that perhaps after all there is something to be said for the eccentrics. The essay was written at a time when, in her mid-30s, she was thinking about what she called obscure lives, delivering her second novel, Night and Day, with great anxiety, and publishing one of her first experimental sketches, Kew Gardens. That is, she was still finding her way as a writer. Though determined to find a completely new way of writing, she was extremely anxious not to be thought of as a literary eccentric. She was acutely aware, no one could be more so, of the thin and perilous line between originality and incoherence, inventiveness and madness. She preferred to be called a genius than an eccentric, and was always pleased if her friends told her she was one. Both words were used of her in her lifetime. In the essay, Woolf says that if you want to be in the Dictionary of National Biography, or to die a dean or a professor, a hero or a prime minister, then you can't be an eccentric. Her choice of eccentrics, mostly women, are people who aren't in public office or have grand careers or distinctions. They are the failures, the oddities, the misfits, the obscure. They might have committed a nuisance in a public place. They don't get biographies written about them. They creep in by the back door into other people's biographies. They creep in by the back door into other people's biographies, like the hero's Uncle John with his passion for the baptismal rite, or his aunt, I forget her name, who knew for certain that the world is shaped like a starfish. They're the opposite of the solid and the serviceable. They are often disheveled and in déshabille from their long obscurity and fantastic behavior, she says. They call for a new kind of biographical writing. Above all, never for a moment do they believe themselves to be eccentric. Her examples include Lady Hester Stanhope, Margaret Fuller, Julia Margaret Cameron, and Margaret, Duchess of Newcastle. The Duchess was one of her candidates in a diary entry for 19th of January 1915 for a possible book of eccentrics. Woolf writes about her again in an essay of 1925 called The Duchess of Newcastle, where her eccentricity, much ridiculed by others in her lifetime, is described affectionately as having something noble and quixotic and high-spirited, as well as crack-brained and bird-witted about it. Woolf notes a fellow feeling for the Duchess, shown by the romantic essayist Charles Lamb, one of Woolf's own favourite writers, and a key figure in the link that I'm proposing to make between eccentricity and essay writing in Woolf. Nobody calls Woolf an eccentric anymore. She outgrew that risk through time. And I suspect that the types of people that were labelled the eccentrics by Woolf are no longer to be found, at least among women. Perhaps historical changes in the women's movement, in the status of women, in more freedoms of behaviour and self-expression since the early to mid-20th century have made the term less relevant or applicable to unusual or odd kinds of behaviour. Women writers and artists who might have used eccentricity in the past as something of a mask or a ploy, a cover or a defense of lesbianism, a means of surviving or making their mark as writers in a male-dominated literary marketplace, no longer need to do so. But the word is still in use, very often applied to physical habits, ways of talking, and quirks of personal behaviour, rather than to a literary style. Sometimes the meaning is that someone is harmlessly weird, odd, or peculiar. The Guardian quick crossword the other day gave eccentric as a clue, and the answer was dotty. Sometimes it's used to suggest a rich, idiosyncratic inner life. A 1999 novel by Anita Bruckner, Undue Influence, begins with the sentence, "It is my conviction that everyone is profoundly eccentric." The narrator goes on to say that the normal-looking people she sees on her way to work are probably harbouring unimaginable fantasies, that most people are entirely inconsistent. We do still find the term applied to certain literary figures, but often now with admiration or interest rather than scorn or disbelief, for instance, to the poet Stevie Smith or Christopher Smart. When used of writers and writing, the word eccentric can have associations with melancholy, quixotism and vulnerability, and also with panache, nonsense, and exhibitionist idiosyncrasy. It is somewhere on the scale between genius and madness. It's the opposite of solid and serviceable. There's often still an element of mockery or bullying in the use of the term. The eccentric is always at the risk of being sidelined, mocked, eliminated, or exterminated. One intriguing contemporary application of the word eccentric is in a collection of 2006 called Side Effects by Adam Phillips, the literary critic, essayist, and psychoanalyst. In an essay in the book, which is called Talking Nonsense and Knowing When to Stop, Phillips cites the psychoanalyst Anna Freud, noting in 1968 that the first generation of psychoanalysts were the odd ones, the dreamers, the neurotics, the self-made, the eccentrics. These types have been eliminated, says Anna Freud, since psychoanalytical training became institutionalized and stricter in favor of sober, well-prepared, professionally efficient types. It's very like Woolf comparing the eccentrics with the solid and the serviceable. Phillips calls Anna Freud's words poignantly nostalgic and sees them as a plea for what he calls the incoherent, the self-contradictory, the nonsensical within the psychoanalytical profession. He describes Anna Freud's wonderful repertory company of the unconventional as the doubters, the dissatisfied, the odd ones, the dreamers, the neurotics, the mentally endangered, the eccentrics, the self-made. And he's talking about the analysts here, not the patients. In his view, such people gave credibility to psychoanalysis as what Phillips calls the science of the indeterminate, and asks us to wonder what we are doing when we make sense. What does this have to do with essay writing? Well, in Side Effects, Phillips compares the modern literary essay, digressive, meandering, artful, inadvertent, inconclusive, saying things in passing, to the things that, in his view, psychoanalysis needs to pay attention to. He says, in much modern writing, it is the things said in passing that are the most striking. What the writer writes while he is writing something else, what the patient happens to say when he is saying what he wants to say, what we dream when we are wanting to sleep. This is what psychoanalysis wants us to attend to. The literary essay as a form, at least from the early 19th century onwards, has not only allowed for the artfulness, the interest of digression, but has also positively encouraged it. The essays of Lamb or Hazlitt or Emerson create the conditions, not unlike a psychoanalytical session, for concentrations and meanderings, for changes of tone and changes of heart over a very small space of time. A version of that paragraph is developed by Adam Phillips in a piece called Up to a Point, the Psychoanalyst and the Essay, which extends that parallel between the curious, digressive, incomplete form of the essay and what psychoanalysis can do or might be. And that piece appears in a recent Oxford University Press collection called On Essays, published in 2020 and edited by Thomas Carshan and Catherine Murphy. This volume has much to say about what might be called eccentricity in essay writing, particularly in the case of Woolf and of her great romantic influencer, Charles Lamb. Thomas Carshan, in his contribution on Woolf's essay Street Haunting, draws many comparisons between Woolf's experimental, playful, questing, digressive essay writing, so much taken up with oddities and the grotesque, and the essay as practiced by Lamb, Montaigne, and Hazlitt. Carshan suggests that the essay in the hands of all these writers is, I quote, a freak of nature, a game, a joke, a whimsy, and a hunt. Felicity James, writing brilliantly on Charles Lamb in this book as an essay writer, repeatedly uses words like odd, strange, dark, slippery, unfamiliar, queer, and weird. He describes Lamb's, quote, mixture of deformity and beauty, the familiar and the strange, as very influential on Woolf, and also later on such grotesque, melancholy, playful, and self-referential modern essayists, writers such as David Foster Wallace or Nicholson Baker. I was excited to see these links being made because I've long been haunted by the way in which Woolf's essays so riskily and so astonishingly take up the imaginative strangeness of her romantic predecessors. In a piece on her essay writing, which I wrote for the 2005 Cambridge Companion on Woolf, I thought about her essays as performances of loose, meandering conversation. And I suggested the perils of this for Woolf. As a narrative strategy, talk can go wrong. There are many voices in Woolf's essays, Coleridge is among them, whose voices reel hopelessly out of control to the verge of incoherence, and who end up not having conversations, but talking to themselves. The danger of coming as close as possible to the talking voice in the form she developed for her essays ran the risk, she knew, of being too meandering, fanciful, random. But she also knew that digressive, fantastical, and fanciful narrative, eccentric narrative, can make for a powerful, seductive, and enthralling kind of essay. The challenge of the essay, as Woolf saw it, was this: never to be yourself and yet always. That is the problem. That's what she says about the imperative of essay writing in The Modern Essay, 1922. The form requires you to write about yourself or your opinions. Its aim, she says, is to make use in literature of yourself. But if the essay form is to work, it must also be about transforming or disguising or transcending that self. It must use its narrative as a kind of veil, partly revealing, partly concealing the self. Woolf's essays are full of metamorphoses, imaginative escapades, self-transformations. Her essays attempt a form of shape-shifting or self-shifting, and constantly they draw on imagery of clouds and dreams and journeys, images that have to do with instability or strangeness. I'll give you just a few examples. In Thunder at Wembley, a satirical view of the British Empire exhibition at Wembley in 1924, she decomposes the entire scene into a rush of storm, dust, whirling wind, a violent commotion, presaging the apocalyptic passing of empire and empires. So that is what comes of letting in the sky, she says. At the cinema, in an essay of 1926 called Cinema, the mind jumps to Shakespeare. Why? Because poets, like the cinema, work through suggestion. And that takes us on a mental journey in which one image metamorphoses into another. She says, in Shakespeare, the most complex ideas, the most intense emotions form chains of images through which we pass, however rapidly and completely they change, as up the loops and spirals of a twisting stair. And films remind her of that process. In Street Haunting of 1927, she proposes that to walk London at dusk, looking at people in the street and in at their rooms, is to recognize that the self is streaked, variegated, all of a mixture. The colors have run. And that it is momentarily possible to persuade ourselves that we can leave the straight lines of personality and deviate into the bodies and minds of others. A form which necessarily has to do with the self also needs for her to take on, as in her many essays on historical figures or on other writers, the personalities of others, to explore the possibility of inhabiting alternative lives. So the imperative of the essay, according to Woolf, never to be yourself and yet always, is something like the condition of a dream, in which we are always ourselves, yet seem to be or go beyond ourselves. One of the things I think she means by never to be yourself and yet always is that being herself involves inhabiting the language of other writers. Woolf will saturate herself in her essays in the voice of the person she's writing about, and her imagination is filled to brimming with the writers that she most reads: Shakespeare, the Elizabethans, the Romantics. Part of the play of essay writing for her is allusion, some of it quite subterranean. And as I've already suggested, one writer whose essays gave her an example of how personality can be played with, made up, dissolved, and reconstituted is Charles Lamb. For her, he's a prose writer to be read as a poet who, she says, soars to the height of fantasy. Actually, it's the heights of fantasy, soars to the heights of fantasy. He was deeply attracted by his melancholy, his fancifulness, his imaginative leaps, his dark comedy, and his self-disguise in the essay writing persona of Elia, under which name he wrote his essays. As Felicity James notes, you often see his influence on Woolf, but perhaps most of all in her extraordinary essay On Being Ill, written in 1925 at a time when she was unwell and first published in 1926. The essay unpredictably metamorphoses through a number of different performances and discusses not only illness, but language, religion, sympathy, solitude, and reading. I'll briefly outline what's going on. Why has illness not been as popular a subject for literature as love, it asks. This couldn't be asked now. Why has the daily drama of the body not been recognized? Why does literature always insist on separating the mind or the soul from the body? Perhaps because readers would never accept illness as a subject for fiction. Perhaps because illness requires a new language, primitive, subtle, sensual, obscene. But illness is almost impossible to communicate. She writes, let a sufferer try to describe a pain in his head to a doctor, and language at once runs dry. There is nothing ready-made for him. He is forced to coin words himself, and taking his pain in one hand and a lump of pure sound in the other, as perhaps the people of Babel did in the beginning, so to crush them together that a brand new word in the end drops out. It's hard to resist in this painful account of the need for a new kind of language between patient and doctor, a reminder of Adam Phillips' psychoanalyst and patient listening out for what can hardly be said. The invalid, she continues, may demand sympathy, but sympathy we cannot have. People at once start complaining about their own condition, and apart from a few social misfits whom she colourfully and rapidly invokes in the essay, the world can't provide regular sympathy. It would take up the whole working day. Besides, illness really prefers solitude. Here we go alone and like it better so. The ill have dropped out of the army of workers and become deserters. This gives them time to do things normal people can't do, like looking at the clouds or the flowers. Lying on their backs, cut off from everyday life, they are free to look up at the endless activity, the interminable experiment of the cloudscape above. And what they find alluring about clouds and flowers is not their sympathy, but their indifference. The ill, unlike the army of the upright, recognize nature's indifference. They know nature is going to win in the end when ice will bury the world. What consolation is there for that thought, she goes on to ask? Organized religion, heaven, an alternative, secular idea of heaven as invented by the poets? And poets, she lightly jumps on, are what we need when ill, not prose writers. In illness, words seem to preserve a mystic quality. We are attracted to intense lines and phrases, to the incomprehensible, to nonsense, to the textures of sounds. We make rash readings without critical intermediaries, for instance, of Shakespeare. And if we've had enough of him, we can read some trash, like some obscure memoir by Augustus Hare, which looks absurd, but turns out, when she tells its story, to be all about pain, death, and agony. This loose improvisation is netted together by a complex pattern of images drawing on water, air, earth, and fire, desert wastes and mountain peaks, deep forests and vast seas, clouds, birds, leaves, and flowers, as though through illness, a whole alternative universe is created. Intensely physical, the writing insists on the body like a pane of glass as the transmitter of all experience. The body cannot be separated off. It is monster and hero, animal and mystic, above all actor, in an essay which is so much about play acting and scene making. As the images in the essay cohere, a satire on conformity begins to emerge. The ill are the deserters, the refuseniks, the eccentrics. They won't accept the cooperative conventions. They blurt things out. They turn sympathizers away. They won't go to work. They lie down. They waste time. They fantasize. They don't go to church or believe in heaven. They refuse to read responsibly sitting up or to make sense of what they read. They are attracted to nonsense, sensation, and rashness. On the other side of the glass is the army of the upright, harnessing energy, driving motor cars, going to work and to church with the heroism of the ant or the bee, writing letters to the Times, communicating and civilizing. There's even a faint suggestion that in separating themselves from the army of workers, the ill are like pacifists or non-combatants, unconscientious objectors who nevertheless have their own battles to fight. Reading when ill is felt to be a form of deviancy, and rash reading, making one's own notes in the margin, seems to also to allow for rash writing, writing with the apparent willful inconsequentiality and inconclusiveness of this essay. On being ill is as much about reading and writing as it is about illness. In fact, it's about reading and desire, as though our erotic longings for absent lovers as we lie in bed with a high temperature get translated into longings for language. The essay is bursting with quotations and allusions, Shakespeare, to romantic writers such as De Quincey, Wordsworth, and Lamb. And all these literary echoes point the same way. They all evoke a longing for escape or a struggle, even a suicidal one, with a hell of human anguish and depression. Charles Lamb gets into On Being Ill with an echo of his 1825 essay, The Convalescent, where his alter ego Elia describes, just as Woolf does, the peculiar state of mind that comes over the sick person who has a nervous fever. Like Woolf, Lamb writes on the supreme selfishness and self-absorption of the sick person, on how he becomes a world unto himself, his own theatre, and how the outside world seems to fall away from him, and how sympathy is limited by sickness. And her satire on the army of the upright invokes Lamb's essay of 1826, Popular Fallacies that we should rise with the lark. Lamb, just like Woolf, says in this essay that it's much better to stay in bed. While the busy part of mankind are fast huddling on their clothes, are already up and about their occupation, content to have swallowed their sleep by wholesale, we chose to linger abed and digest our dreams. And also, he adds mournfully, why should we get up? We have nothing here to expect, but in a short time, a sick bed and a dismissal. That sad, quirky, idiosyncratic tone of voice lingers on in the non-conformity of Woolf's essay. On Being Ill enters into the undiscovered country of illness with the kind of shape-changing unpredictability of the cloudscapes which it describes. It moves freely and strangely between desire, solitude, suffering, reading, and language, as it plays out the transformations to the self brought about by illness. It sympathizes with the eccentric behavior of the ill person, and it has also perfected essay writing as a form of literary deviancy, experiment, and eccentricity.